The Monster of Lake Tahoe. In the autumn of 1923, fishermen on the shores of Lake Tahoe near Reno made a discovery that would shake even the most experienced investigators to their core. What they found in those fog-shrouded morning hours was so horrific that 3 of the responding police officers had to resign from duty. Deep beneath the water's surface, hidden in an underground cave near Emerald Bay, lay a secret dungeon, a place where, over 2 decades, people had vanished. 35 souls. Men, women, children, tourists, travelers, seekers, all sharing one thing in common. They had come to experience the healing powers of the lake. But instead of healing, they found a nightmare from which there was no awakening. The man who had created this hell was no ordinary criminal. It was Dr. Henry Waterman, a respected physician and naturalist who was revered throughout the Lake Tahoe region as a benefactor. For over 20 years, he had played his cruel game, disguised as a healer who helped the sick and desperate. Before we dive into the terrifying truth that lay hidden beneath the waves of Lake Tahoe, I want to ask you something important. This channel explores the darkest corners of American history. Stories so disturbing that most people look away. If you're still here, you're not like everyone else. You understand that some truths must be told, no matter how horrifying they are. Subscribe to our channel now and become part of our community of fearless truth seekers. And write in the comments, what region are you watching from? Are you brave enough to learn what happened in your own backyard? The Lake Tahoe region of 1900 was a place full of mysticism and promises of healing. The largest alpine lake in North America, nestled between California and Nevada, had attracted people seeking relief from their ailments for centuries. The clear mountain air, the pure water, and the picturesque landscape were considered natural remedies for all manner of complaints. Tuberculosis patients, rheumatism sufferers, people with nervous disorders, they all made pilgrimages to the shores of the lake, hoping for recovery. During this era of flourishing health tourism, Dr. Henry Waterman established himself as a leading figure in natural medicine at Lake Tahoe. His clinic, Serenity Manor, perched on a hillside above the picturesque town of Emerald Cove. The imposing Art Nouveau building, with its white columns and large windows, offering a breathtaking view of the lake, was visible from miles away. Patients from across the country traveled to be treated by Dr. Waterman. His methods were considered revolutionary, his success rate extraordinary. Henry Waterman was 58 years old in 1923, a tall man with a piercing gaze, silver gray hair, and a voice that radiated both authority and trust. He always dressed in elegant dark suits and carried a gold walking stick with a silver fish head as its handle, a gift, he claimed, from a grateful prince whom he had pulled back from death's door. His hands were always immaculately manicured, despite the supposedly intensive work with natural remedies. What distinguished Dr. Waterman from other physicians was his deep understanding of his patient's psychology. He had a masterful ability to inspire hope and build trust. His patients worshipped him almost religiously. He promised not just physical healing, but spiritual renewal through the mystical powers of Lake Tahoe. In his lectures, which he regularly held in the Manor's Great Hall, he spoke of ancient secrets hidden in the depths of the lake, of a water source that the indigenous peoples had revered as sacred, of an underground stream that flowed directly from the heart of the Sierra Nevada, enriched with extraordinary minerals. The treatments at Serenity Manor followed a strictly secret protocol that Waterman called his life's work. Patients first had to undergo a weeks-long preparatory phase, during which they were isolated from the outside world. No visits, no mail, no contact. This was necessary, Waterman explained, to avoid disturbing the spiritual purification. The family must understand that the healing process required absolute concentration. The transformation from respected doctor to systematic murderer had begun gradually. All evidence suggests that the turning point came in 1901, when Waterman's own wife Elizabeth died of tuberculosis. Despite all his medical knowledge, despite all the promises of natural medicine, he had been unable to save her. Witnesses later reported that his personality changed fundamentally after this loss. He became obsessive, increasingly spoke of things that went beyond rational medicine, of immortality, of overcoming death itself. The first disappearance occurred in the spring of 1902. Margaret Holman, a 36-year-old widow from San Francisco, had come to treat her severe melancholy at Serenity Manor. Her family had saved for months to afford her the expensive stay. After 3 weeks without any news, her sister became worried and traveled to Emerald Cove herself. Dr. Waterman received her with deep sympathy. Margaret, he reported, had suffered a relapse despite all efforts. In a moment of mental confusion, she had fled from the manor at night and had, it was assumed, taken her own life in the cold waters of the lake. They had searched for days, but the lake had not released her mortal remains. The story was tragic but plausible. Lake Tahoe was known for sometimes never releasing those who drowned. The currents were treacherous, the depths unfathomable. Margaret's family mourned, but they did not doubt Waterman's account. He had done everything in his power. He had even waived his payment, out of compassion for her fate. This pattern would repeat itself countless times over the next 20 years. Patients came to Serenity Manor, were cut off from the outside world, and then vanished without a trace. Waterman always had a plausible explanation. Some patients had recovered so well that they spontaneously decided to travel onward to begin their new lives. Others had tragically suffered relapses and died, their bodies swallowed by the lake or lost in the mountains. Still others had decided to start new lives under new names, free from their burdened past. What no one suspected was that Dr. Waterman had discovered an underground cave beneath the manor, a natural karst system connected to the lake through a hidden passage. In this cave, accessible only at low water levels, he had set up his true laboratory. Here, deep underground, he conducted his cruel experiments that went far beyond any medical ethics. He was obsessed with the idea of defeating death, of unlocking the secret of immortality. His patients were no longer people seeking healing. They were test subjects in his insane pursuit of forbidden knowledge. The underground cave was connected to the manor's cellar through a complicated mechanism. A system of tubes and channels allowed Waterman to bring living patients unnoticed into the depths. Down there, in the cold, damp darkness, far from any human ear, he could work undisturbed. The screams echoed only against stone walls and were swallowed by the rushing of underground water. Waterman's scientific reputation helped him deflect any suspicion. He regularly published articles in medical journals, gave lectures at universities, and was even named an honorary member of several scientific societies. His reputation as a pioneer of natural medicine was so firmly established that no one dared question his methods or his success reports. The few voices that expressed doubts were dismissed as jealous competitors who wanted to hinder the progress of modern medicine. Particularly insidious was Waterman's selection of his victims. He preferred people who were isolated, patients without close family ties, travelers who left no one behind who would search for them, wealthy invalids whose disappearance would more likely be explained by a fresh start abroad than by a crime. And he chose those who had entrusted him with their fortunes, hoping that their treatment would heal them. The financial side of his crime was as systematic as the medical. Each patient had to deposit a substantial sum before beginning treatment. These funds, Waterman assured them, would be managed in a trust fund and refunded in case of failure. Of course, money was never refunded. The sums flowed into Waterman's growing fortune, which he cleverly invested in real estate and artwork. His manor became ever more magnificent, his collection of rare medical instruments ever more extensive. Dr. Richard Mason, a young physician who worked for several months as an assistant at Serenity Manor in 1918, was one of the first to notice inconsistencies. Mason was idealistic, fresh from university, and he initially revered Waterman as a role model. But the longer he worked at the manor, the more he was disturbed by small things that didn't add up. He noticed that certain areas of the manor were off limits to him. The east wing in the cellar, for example, was always locked, and Waterman explained that it contained dangerous chemical substances that could only be handled by him personally. Mason also noticed that patient files mysteriously disappeared. People who had supposedly recovered and left the manor left no complete records, no discharge reports, no contact information, no information about their whereabouts. What troubled Mason most, however, was the fact that he never saw the patients who supposedly received the most intensive treatment. Waterman often spoke of his special patients in the East Wing, but Mason was never allowed to examine or even see them. When he asked, he was put off with vague explanations about the necessity of absolute rest and isolation. One night, driven by growing unease, Mason decided to explore the forbidden area. He waited until the manor was asleep, then took a spare key and opened the door to the East Wing. What he found there made his blood run cold. A long corridor led deeper down than the normal cellar structure should reach. The walls were damp, and a musty smell hung in the air. At the end of the corridor, Mason heard something that shook him to his core. Soft, whimpering, human voices, weak and desperate, coming from the depths. Before he could go further, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned and saw Dr. Waterman standing in the glow of an oil lamp. The old doctor smiled, but it was a cold, menacing smile. "Mr. Mason," Waterman said calmly, "you should not have been here." What followed was a conversation Mason would never forget. Waterman spoke openly about his work, his conviction that true medical knowledge could only be gained through experiments that went beyond the narrow boundaries of conventional ethics. He described his search for the secret of life itself, his attempts to overcome mortality. "You don't understand, Mason," Waterman whispered, with a feverish gleam in his eyes. "Death is not the end. It is a threshold we can cross. These people here, they are not victims. They are pioneers. Through their sacrifice, humanity will become immortal." Mason realized in that moment that he was dealing with a madman, a highly intelligent but completely obsessed man who had lost all connection to reality. But Mason was also clever enough to recognize that he was in acute danger. He played along, nodded understandingly, lied that he was fascinated by Waterman's vision. Waterman, in his arrogance, actually believed he had won a disciple. He led Mason deeper into the cave, showed him his underground laboratory. What Mason saw there would haunt him in nightmares for the rest of his life. In primitive cages, barely larger than dog kennels, people huddled. Some were barely conscious, others stared blankly into nothingness. On the walls hung medical instruments that resembled torture devices more than healing tools. Everywhere lay records, filled with Waterman's meticulous notes on his experiments. Mason managed to escape that night. He swore to Waterman that he would keep his secret, that he understood how important this work was. Waterman, blinded by his own ego, let him go. But as soon as Mason had left the manor, he ran to the nearest police station. The problem was, no one believed him. Dr. Henry Waterman was a respected person, an esteemed physician, a philanthropist. Young Dr. Mason, on the other hand, was a nobody, fresh from university, without reputation. The police listened to his story and considered it the fantasies of an overworked, perhaps mentally unstable young man. Some suspected Mason himself was suffering from nervous illness and needed treatment. Mason desperately tried to find someone who would believe him. He wrote letters to medical oversight agencies, to newspapers, to anyone who he thought could help. But everywhere he met with rejection or indifference. Waterman's reputation was too firmly established. The idea that he could be a monster was simply too absurd. In his desperation, Mason began to investigate on his own. He traveled through the Lake Tahoe region and spoke with families whose relatives had been treated at Serenity Manor and never returned. He collected names, dates, circumstances. He began to recognize a pattern. Over 20 years, people had disappeared. Always the same scheme. Always the same reassuring explanations from Dr. Waterman. Mason's research brought him into contact with other people who also harbored doubts. There was Grace Holman, the sister of the first known missing person, who had never stopped searching for answers. There was Detective Frank Bergen from Reno, an experienced investigator who over the years had handled several missing persons cases around Lake Tahoe and had noticed a certain clustering connected to Serenity Manor. And there was Father John Richards, a priest who had been contacted by desperate relatives and had begun keeping his own records. This small group of people, united by their doubt and suspicion, began systematically collecting evidence. They documented every case of a patient who had gone to Serenity Manor and disappeared without a trace. They created timelines, analyzed Waterman's stories for contradictions, spoke with former employees of the manor. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A fisherman named Anthony Miller had observed something strange in the autumn of 1922. At night, during a full moon, he had seen Dr. Waterman rowing a boat to a remote spot on the lake. Miller, who was engaged in illegal night fishing and therefore didn't want to be seen, had hidden and watched. He saw Waterman throw heavy sacks into the water, sacks that looked suspiciously like human bodies. Miller had remained silent at the time, afraid to admit his own illegal activity. But when Dr. Mason sought him out and told him of his suspicions, the fisherman broke his silence. He described exactly the spot where Waterman had sunk the sacks. Detective Bergen, now convinced by the accumulated evidence, organized an unofficial diving expedition. What they found in the dark depths of Lake Tahoe exceeded their worst fears. Anchored at the bottom of the lake, at a depth of 100 feet, lay dozens of sacks. When the divers recovered the first sacks and opened them, they found human remains. Skeletons, some still with scraps of clothing. Someone had tried to weigh them down with stones, but some of the sacks had come loose over the years and had slowly drifted toward the surface. With this concrete evidence, Detective Bergen could finally obtain an official search warrant. On the 20th of October, 1923, a foggy autumn morning, a contingent of police officers stormed Serenity Manor. Dr. Waterman was arrested at breakfast, calmly and without resistance. He even smiled as the handcuffs were placed on him, as if the whole thing were an interesting experiment he was observing from scientific distance. The search of the manor lasted weeks. The hidden access to the underground cave was found, concealed behind a heavy statue in Waterman's private library. A complicated mechanism opened a passage leading into the depths. What the investigators found down there was a scene from hell itself. The cave was more extensive than suspected, a natural cave system that extended over several levels. Waterman had expanded it over years and transformed it into a macabre research center. In the upper levels were the cages where he had held his victims captive. Rusty iron bars, narrow bunks, chains on the walls. Everything was damp from proximity to the lake, covered with moss and mold. Deeper down was his laboratory, a large room, illuminated by a series of gas lamps hanging from a complex pipe system. Here stood tables full of medical instruments, glass flasks with indefinable liquids, shelves full of books and records. On the walls hung anatomical drawings, diagrams, formulas, everything meticulously documented, like the work of a mad scientist who believed he stood at the threshold of a great discovery. The most horrifying thing, however, was the deepest room, a kind of crypt where Waterman had kept the corpses of his victims. Some were preserved, embalmed with self-developed methods. Others simply lay on stone benches, left to the natural process of decay. Waterman had documented every death, photographed every phase of decomposition, meticulously recorded every change in the body after death. The records that were seized filled over 100 leather volumes. They contained detailed descriptions of Waterman's experiments. He had systematically tortured his victims, not out of sadism, as investigators initially assumed, but out of scientific curiosity. He had tested the limits of the human body, tested how much pain a person could endure, how long someone could survive without food, without water, without light. Particularly horrifying were his attempts at reanimation. Waterman had been obsessed with the idea of bringing dead organisms back to life. He had performed primitive electroshock treatments, injected chemicals, desperately trying to bring back life after he himself had taken it. Of course, all these attempts had failed, but that had not stopped him from seeking ever new victims for his cruel experiments. Identifying the victims was a Herculean task. Many of the bodies were barely recognizable as human. But based on clothing items, personal belongings, and Waterman's meticulous records, most victims could be identified by name. 35 people, men and women between 20 and 60 years old, all had come to Serenity Manor hoping for healing. All had trusted Dr. Waterman. News of the discovery spread like wildfire through the Lake Tahoe region and beyond. People were shocked, incredulous, horrified. How could such a respected man, a physician whose duty it was to heal, become such a monster? Serenity Manor, once a symbol of hope, became overnight a synonym for horror and deception. The trial of Dr. Henry Waterman began on the 15th of January, 1924, in the Reno courthouse. The hall was packed with journalists, spectators, and relatives of the victims. Waterman appeared calm and composed, dressed in an elegant black suit. They had taken away his silver walking stick. He seemed more like an interested observer than a defendant. The charges were read: 35 counts of murder, false imprisonment, desecration of corpses. The list of accusations seemed endless. But Waterman showed no remorse. Instead, he used the trial as a stage for his insane theories. He spoke of scientific progress, of the necessity of making sacrifices for the advancement of humanity. He called himself a misunderstood genius, a martyr of science. Only one thing caused him to briefly lose his composure. Dr. Mason took the witness stand. When Waterman saw his former assistant, his facial expression changed. For the first time, something like emotion showed. It wasn't regret, no shame. It was disappointment. Disappointment that someone he had seen as a potential successor had betrayed him. Mason's testimony was clear and detailed. He described the night he discovered the underground cave. He recounted the conversations with Waterman, the absurd theories, the insane plans. And he described the living victims he had seen then, people who might have been saved if someone had believed him at the time. This last remark hung heavily in the room, for it was an indictment not only against Waterman, but against all those who had ignored Mason's warnings, against the police who had not believed him, against the society that had preferred to trust the respected doctor rather than the unknown young man. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Over 100 witnesses were heard. The evidence was overwhelming. In the end, there was only one possible verdict: guilty on all counts. Dr. Henry Waterman was sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was carried out on the 2nd of May, 1924. Waterman's last words were characteristic of his delusion. "You hang me today, but in 100 years, people will celebrate me as a visionary. Posterity will understand what you cannot grasp today." The execution was witnessed by several hundred people. But there was no satisfaction, no relief. The death of a monster could not bring back the lives he had destroyed. It could not restore the trust he had abused. Serenity Manor was demolished. The ground was blessed, salted, and declared uninhabitable. Today, nothing stands there. Only a small memorial commemorates the victims. 35 names on a bronze plaque, people who sought healing and found death. The underground cave was sealed and closed. The access from the lake was blocked with concrete blocks. They wanted to ensure that no one would ever enter this place of horror again. But fishermen report to this day of strange apparitions in the area, lights underwater, voices that seem to come from the depths. Many avoid the spot where Waterman's cave lies. The story of the Monster of Lake Tahoe changed many things. It led to stricter controls of medical facilities. Patients could no longer be completely isolated from the outside world. Regular inspections had to take place. Patient rights were strengthened. But the real damage was psychological in nature. Trust in the authority of physicians was shaken. The naive notion that someone with a title and reputation must automatically be good was destroyed. People had learned that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear white coats and friendly smiles. Dr. Richard Mason, the man who ultimately brought the truth to light, could never work as a doctor again. The experiences had marked him too deeply. He withdrew, lived quietly and in seclusion until his death in 1947. In his last days, he often spoke of still hearing the screams of the people he had seen in the cave that night, the screams that haunted him for a lifetime. The relatives of the victims fought for years for appropriate compensation. Waterman's considerable fortune was confiscated and divided among the families, but no amount of money could make up for the loss. No sum could answer the question that tormented everyone. How could they have been so blind? The story was hushed up for decades. It was too painful, too shameful. The Lake Tahoe region wanted to forget, to move on, to preserve the image of an idyllic vacation paradise. Tourists should not be deterred by stories of underground hells and insane doctors. But the truth cannot be buried forever. The victims deserve to be remembered. Their stories must be told, not to shock, but to warn. To remind us that we must remain vigilant, that we must question, even when someone seems trustworthy, that we must listen when someone raises the alarm, even when it is uncomfortable. The Monster of Lake Tahoe is long dead. The cave is sealed. The manor is demolished. But the lesson remains. Evil often hides behind the mask of respectability. Monsters can look like healers. And the greatest danger is not that we fail to recognize evil, but that we refuse to see it, even when all the signs lie before us.